everyone, and welcome to this video tutorial on how to apply the law on economic duress to a contract law scenario. In this tutorial, we're going to be looking at the Aminah and Roshan mini scenario. We're going to recap the law on economic duress and look at how we would use that idea structure to answer a scenario on economic duress in order to get a really nice answer to this question. As always then, let's start by looking at the situation we've been given. So we've been told that Aminah agreed to pay Roshan £700 to decorate 3 rooms in her house. He stripped wallpaper from 2 rooms, but then told Aminah that he had made an error in pricing and now needed a further £150. Aminah reluctantly agreed to pay the extra money. And you're being asked to advise Aminah whether there is anything she can do. And this involves potentially economic duress, because what's happening for Aminah here is that where a party to a contract such as Roshan threatens to cancel the contract unless the other party, Aminah, agrees to their demands of more money, then Aminah has no other practical option really but to agree to the new terms of the contract, because he's already started, he's stripped the wallpaper. If she doesn't pay him this extra, she's scared she's going to be left with a house in a mess. So she feels that she's been put under undue pressure to pay the extra money. And this is what economic duress is all about. And I think this would be a good point for us just to quickly recap what the rules are on economic duress. Please remember that I've done a separate video tutorial on economic duress in which I go through all of the rules and all of the cases in detail. So you may want to go and watch that again before you actually try and apply the law on it so that it's fresh in your mind. But as I've already touched on, duress, if you remember, is where a party enters into agreement as a result of threats, and where a party enters a contract because of duress, they may have the contract set aside. Originally, in the past, the common law only recognised threats of unlawful physical violence, but in more recent times, the courts have recognised economic duress as giving rise to a valid claim, and that's really what Aminah is looking for here. Really, the whole basis of duress as a vitiating factor in contract law is that there's an absence of free consent. So yes, Aminah has agreed to pay the £150, but that consent to pay it wasn't really freely given. Now, in order to prove economic duress and make her contract voidable, Aminah needs to show these 5 things. So these are the 5 rules, and we'll just quickly recap them here. So firstly, she has to prove that pressure was exerted on her. Secondly, the pressure was illegitimate. Thirdly, the pressure induced her to enter the contract. Fourthly, she had no choice but to enter the contract. And finally, she protested at the time or shortly after the contract was made. In order to write this up, on this slide here, I've got how we would use ideas specifically for economic duress. So we would start off by identifying that our claimant, in this case Aminah, might be able to have her contract set aside because of economic duress. We then define duress. So I've put duress in contract law relates to where a person enters an agreement as a result of threats. I would then explain all of the rules on economic duress using the cases. And because there isn't a lot really on economic duress, I would want you to be outlining what happens in the cases to help illustrate the rules. And then in terms of application, you need to, this is quite handy really, because it acts as a checklist. You need to check whether each of the rules of duress applies to your scenario, and then conclude, if you've got them all, that your contract can be set aside. Next slide, I've done a bullet point answer to the Aminah scenario. So you might want to pause the video here so that you can have a good read of it. I've identified my I, my D, my E and my A here. You can ignore the little red ones. That's just a rough mark scheme for if we were doing this timed in class. So we've already sort of looked at the I, the D and the E. Let's focus on the application for Aminah then. So I'm going through each of these 5 rules in order as they apply to Aminah. So firstly, I've said that pressure has been put on Aminah to pay an extra £150. So the first requirement is met, just as in North Ocean shipping. 2, the pressure seems illegitimate because in Atlas and CAFCO, the defendant was not able to enforce an agreement where the defendants had put pressure on the claimant because of an underestimation. Now, I've done this very bullet pointy here so I can fit it all on one slide, but I would elaborate on that and say that it seems like Roshan has underestimated the cost of doing the work, and that's his error. And if we reason by analogy, it does seem to be a bit like the case of Atlas, which seems that the pressure is therefore illegitimate. The pressure has induced Aminah to agree to the higher price, like in Barton and Armstrong, and it can be argued that Aminah had no choice but to enter into the contract because the work had already begun and she needed it to be completed. So she didn't really have any other option. It's unclear from the scenario, and it's fine to write this in the exam. You're not always given all of the facts in a scenario, so it doesn't say actually whether Aminah protested or not. So I've said it's unclear whether Aminah protested, but the fact that she, in inverted commas, reluctantly, so that was the word from the scenario, paid, suggests that she did complain at the time or shortly afterwards. And on that basis, it seems that Aminah meets all 5 requirements and can have her contract set aside. So I hope that's been helpful in showing you the approach to answering on economic duress. I think in the exam, it's quite possible that you would get misrepresentation and economic duress in one scenario, because as you can see, there isn't an awful lot to economic duress. But there is a larger economic duress scenario in your booklet, this one, the Nora and the bricks scenario. So I advise you use that idea structure that I've just outlined to try and come up with a nice answer to this question.